Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Harold Koplewicz, a child and adolescent psychiatrist and the president of the Child Mind Institute. We are the only national nonprofit dedicated to transforming the lives of children and families who are struggling with mental health and learning disorders. And we're also committed to telling stories that break down mental health stigma. And we are so pleased to be here today with a remarkable friend as part of Advertising Week's Great Minds Think Unalike. Ali Wentworth is an actress, comedian, author, producer, and mother. She's made a name for herself on the comedy series In Living Color and has appeared on such television shows as The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, Seinfeld, and The Oprah Winfrey Show. Her film credits include Jerry Maguire, The Real Blonde, and Office Space, and she's also been a longtime friend of the Child Mind Institute and an advocate for people struggling with depression. And I'm so thrilled that she has agreed to speak with us today. And most recently, she's become the host of a new podcast called Go Ask Ali. So let's start at the very beginning. Ali,
Yeah.
where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Washington, D.C. I was born and raised there. My parents were in political journalism. My mother was social secretary of the White House, stepfather editor of the London Sunday Times, grew up during Watergate, and left after I went to NYU to go be a big star in Hollywood.
So before we get to the big star in Hollywood, what was little Ali like? What's your earliest memories?
Little Ali, my parents were divorced when I was 1 year old, so that tells you a lot. They both remarried, and so when I was in elementary school, I was kind of shuttling between my father's home and my mother's home. Both of them remarried and had children. So if I had to come up with a word for what I was as little Ali, it would be very lost.
And so tell me, do you remember, was school a positive experience? I mean, was that a place that was a safe haven, or were you one of those kids who didn't like to go to school and had the Sunday night blues?
Very much so. I went to an all-girls school, and there I had a famous class for mean girls. Like, they still talk about it. I'm terrified of confrontation and nastiness. And so I would cry all the time and say I was sick. I always had stomach aches. I never wanted to go to school. I was terrified of the kind of mean social network. And my parents thought it would be a good idea to send me to boarding school. So they sent me to an all-girls boarding school, which basically for me was Orange is the New Black. I mean, I was like in women's prison, and
Ali, how old were you when they sent you to boarding school?
14.
Who was your best friend in the early years? First, second, third grade?
Cecilia Wenzel.
Is she still a friend?
Yeah, she is. I mean, as what happened.
Understanding, was that one of the? I mean, was she a mean girl or was she an understanding girl?
She was an understanding girl.
So and you're still friends. That's cool. And yeah. Were you a good student?
I was good when I was interested.
So what were the subjects that interested you?
English, art, drama, everything but math and science.
Okay. So you weren't going to be pre-med. That was clear.
From day one.
But were you failing those subjects, or you just weren't great at them?
I just wasn't great at them, and I did the least amount necessary to get by.
So, you were just talking about your parents and your step-parents. They all sound very high-powered. I think, if I'm not mistaken, you even have a grandmother that was a famous explorer. It seems like a very high-pressured, performance-driven environment. Am I getting that right, or were you oblivious to it?
Yes. No, I think it was all of those things. And I also think that because of what they did, because of the political climate at the time, like I said, Watergate, the pressure was even higher. It wasn't just they were clocking in, at the factory and coming home. It was like they were all involved in what was going on in the world, which at the time was Watergate. So there was a lot of pressure and tension and strive for excellence.
So we're, I always feel like we can't choose our parents carefully enough. We kind of like, that's who they are. Do you think of them now in retrospect as being maybe somewhat neglectful because they were so consumed by their work?
Yes. And I say that being very close to my parents, particularly my mother, neglectful, but not obviously consciously. But I think at the time their jobs necessitated them to be so focused on them. So, and I think it was, the 70s, 80s, it was very much like, kids, you go to school and do your thing, and we're doing our thing, and then you go up and do your homework and go to bed. I mean, that was sort of the way we did it.
Right. No, the idea of helicopter parenting certainly didn't come in during those decades. So,
No.
so I think about the way you describe it, it almost sounds like a kind of stiff upper lip upbringing. You once said that you asked your mother about a history of depression, and your mother said, no, the family doesn't have any. And yet it sounds like all four of your grandparents suffered from mood disorder symptoms. So how did that attitude affect you? So, I think I've told you that my parents were Holocaust survivors, and my mother used to say, when I would tell her I was upset about something, she would say, well, the Holocaust is over. Your father's no longer in a concentration camp. And that kind of like minimized the experience that I still was having a tough day. And I was delighted that Hitler was dead. But nevertheless, it was still tough. And it sounds like in some ways your mother was minimizing how you were feeling by saying, we don't have depression in our family.
Yes. I think there was a stigma about it. Like, you would never admit to, which by the way, as we know, is different today. And I have 2 daughters on Zoloft that just tell everybody and tell all their friends, like, oh, I can't, I have anxiety, I got to take my Zoloft. That would never have been said in my household growing up. I mean, I was told if I were depressed to close my eyes and think about Christmas.
I love that. That technique is almost as good as my mother saying, bang your head against the wall, and when you stop banging your head, you'll know happiness. But closing, I think it's a little bit more gentle when you just have to close your eyes and think about Christmas.
Yeah.
So you go to a boarding school.
Mm-hmm.
Did being away from your family change your personality? Did you feel relief, or did you just feel, you just said it was like Orange is the New Black. Were you incredibly homesick?
Yes, I was. In fact, when I was dropped off at boarding school, I held on to the bumper of the Volvo and wouldn't let them leave. And then my mother had to trick me and then I got, I'd let go of the car and I started walking in the dorm because I thought she was coming with me, and I just heard the peel out of the gravel as she left. But I felt like I was always in survival mode. It was like I wasn't home. I was really homesick. I was suddenly in this whole new environment, and everything was about survival. Like, oh, I better smoke cigarettes because the cool girls smoke cigarettes, and that's how I'm going to survive. And I better do that. So that's what I mean by Orange is the New Black. For me, it was all about survival.
And were there any hints of depression yet? Because it sounds like you were in high anxiety mode, but I'm not sure. I mean, how was your appetite? How was your sleep, your concentration?
Yeah,
your
I
mood?
I didn't have any eating disorders. I didn't particularly get into drugs. I never drank. I never liked the taste of alcohol. What I found was I channeled my anxiety into comedy. So if I were hanging out with a bunch of people and I was anxious, which to me is adrenaline, I would be entertaining. I would do characters. I would joke around. I would, find ways of being, quote unquote, the class clown. In fact, at that point in my life, I did not even want to be sort of sexual or threatening. And so I put on like 40 pounds. So, I was literally like the funny fat best friend. And it was a role I could hide in.
So this was most of high school, you're saying?
Yeah.
So when do you get the idea of NYU? In other words, I'm going to get serious about this, because did you go to Tisch or you went to NYU Arts and Sciences? What part of NYU
Tisch.
did you go to?
Tisch.
So Tisch has always been a remarkably competitive, acting, directing, fine arts program, movie making program. So you must have gotten serious at a certain point, whether you were the fat girl or the skinny girl. You got driven. What happened?
I realized that I could lose myself in drama, that I felt good and happy when I was pretending to be somebody else.
And so tell me what the 4 years of college were like.
So I actually started at Bard College, and I was a drama major there. I transferred to NYU because Bard was just a little too small for me. And
it's also in the middle of the country. I mean, it's like Hudson Valley. I mean, country meaning rural. It's, not anywhere near the city. So
no, not anywhere near the city. And I really wanted a bigger environment and more classes about drama. And so I went to NYU and loved it, did a million plays. I was doing this play by a playwright named Christopher Durang. and I was playing a cellist, and this very, almost like a nun, very non-sexual, nerdy cellist. And I was on stage and I spread my legs to bring the cello in, and I did it in such a sexual way, but as the character not having any idea. And it got such a huge laugh that at that minute I was like, this is what I'm doing. This is how I want to feel all the time. And so after NYU, I did a few plays in New York, and then I moved to Los Angeles because somebody at the William Morris Agency said, hey, you gotta, you're pretty average, like girl next door, go to Hollywood. And I said, fine, I will.
So before that, just to be a child psychiatrist for a second, we know that autism comes on before 3. We know anxiety symptoms start showing at about 8. Depression can start at 13, and really serious mental health disorders can happen at 18 or 19. You can start seeing schizophrenia or even bipolar, manic depressive illness. So during those years of 18 to 22, which is college, were there any signs and symptoms of depression yet?
Yes, I think so. I mean, now that I have had a lot of therapy, I can look back and yes, they sort of manifested themselves in different ways. Again, I wasn't self-medicating. I sort of channeled it into a boyfriend, meaning if I can get this boy to like me, if I can get this boy to love me, if I can get this one particular boy, then I'll be happy. So I kind of channeled it into that. And then every emotion that happened for me was a consequence of him. So if he ignored me, I would take to my bed for days. If he smiled upon me, then I was elated. If he, cheated with another girl on me, I was a wreck for weeks, wouldn't go to class. So those were the first signs I thought, why am I giving this person so much power? And why are my emotions dictated by him?
So it's really interesting. You're talking about exquisite rejection sensitivity. None of us like to be rejected, but when it affects our behavior, our sleep pattern, our appetite, that's the definition of rejection sensitivity. And yet you picked a profession that has to tolerate a lot of rejection, right? You don't get most parts, you only get some of the parts, but it was more related, you're saying, to the person you were in love with or infatuated with who had that kind of power.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So when does therapy start? Or when do you say this isn't making sense? I need to disconnect this power. I have to own this power.
Therapy came after college, and I went through a series of therapists because, and no offense, but I got some doozies. I had some bad. I mean, they should have been reported to the psychoanalytic board. Right. I had some that I would be crying about my parents' divorce, and she'd stop me and ask me where I got my boots, that kind of thing. Right. So I had some therapy in New York. I went to LA, and it wasn't until, and I don't want to skip ahead because I know you're going to ask me about it, till I had kind of a breakdown in LA that I got serious therapy.
So, I think anyone watching this who thinks about therapy, the trouble is that a lot of times it does seem like a bad comedy or a bad drama. And so if there's a message that we could send out there to anybody who's worried about their child or about themselves, that when you go and interview a mental health professional, you should ask them the same amount of questions you would ask an architect, right?
Absolutely.
So and inevitably we're so vulnerable when we go see a mental health professional, we don't ask those questions. We don't say, how long will it take to give me a diagnosis? How long will it take before you give me my treatment options? What are the treatments success rate if I do this versus that? And a lot of times it just seems so open-ended, especially when we're feeling vulnerable, that we may start down the road that might not be helpful. I'm not saying that it could be hurtful, but I think the time we waste can be hurtful.
I didn't ask any of those questions. I mean, one of the therapists I got out of the back of a magazine or something. I don't remember.
So there was never a time, let's go back just for a second, that your mom or dad or one of your family members said, you know what, Ali, you don't seem as happy as you should be. You're very moody. Maybe you should get a mental health professional, or that was just not part of their vocabulary.
No, not part of their vocabulary. And the fact that I started to get a lot of therapy, it was kind of like, oh, how self-indulgent, but I mean, if that's what you want to do. It wasn't until years later that I've been the person to show my family how important it is to get help and to, have a doctor for your head as much as a doctor for anything else.
So when do you get that episode, or that, first of all, when do you get a diagnosis? Did anyone give you a diagnosis, and when does that happen?
Nobody gave me a diagnosis at this point until I had this breakdown in LA. And
Let's talk about that.
Okay.
When did it start? How did you know it was happening, or did you know it's happening? Did someone else have to tell you, hey, watch out, you're in trouble?
I knew because I was engaged to be married, and I ended the relationship and moved out. And again, it was a similar pattern for me. Even though I had ended the relationship, I was very unsure of myself. I was very unsure if I'd done the right thing. And he started seeing somebody else, and I spiraled and felt like I couldn't survive, felt like I had made a big mistake. And what happened was I stopped sleeping and I stopped eating. And my older brother came to see me, and I was still like in the same pajamas I had been for a week. And I was, when you don't sleep at all for a week, you get a little delirious. And I was very delirious, and I physically couldn't eat. And he kept buying me smoothies, and I couldn't even take a sip. And it became worse and worse. And then thank God I had my brother. He said, you need help. We have to get help. There's something wrong.
And how did he find the help? What did he do?
So he took me to a few different doctors, because, he and I didn't really know what was going on. We had no idea. Like, we didn't even know if this was some physical thing. Did I have some weird disease? And so we saw a few doctors, and all I can tell you is that we trusted our gut. The first couple of doctors, it didn't feel right. One of the doctors, the first thing she said was that I should go buy a stuffed animal. And finally, I found a fantastic therapist, and she said, you need some help. You need some help, and you need an antidepressant, because even if we had therapy all day long every day, you're just not even in a state to absorb it and be able to use it. And, the Zoloft and this therapist literally saved my life. And during that time, again, my mother was like, have an English muffin with a tomato on it. And, that kind of, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. And it was like, no, the bootstraps are broken. Like, I can't pick myself up. And it was the scariest time in my life, but I feel so much stronger now as a human being, because I know I can survive that, and I know how to get help and the tools that if it ever happened again, I would know how to deal with it.
So how long did it take before you thought, I can see some light at the end of the tunnel?
It
took weeks? Was it months? Was it days?
It was a couple months. I had to, the Zoloft had to start working, and we had to up the dosage to get to a point where I actually could really feel that. I went to a outpatient depression clinic in New York City for a couple weeks, which helped me. And I would say 2 or 3 months, I started to feel okay. But, I was then 90 pounds. I was still having a hard time eating and sleeping. Like, I was a very fragile bird.
And so when do you start working again? When do you feel like, it's almost like a gray cloud, it sounds like, or a black, cloud is there, and then it finally starts to lift, that you thought, I'm back. I can make jokes. I can go for an audition. I can go on a date.
I thought I would never be funny again or think anything was funny again. And, there's a moment where I just thought, oh, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. This is it. I can't, and there was, concern that just physically, because I wasn't eating, that was not too far off. But so after the Zoloft and I started going to therapy a lot, I just started to feel a little bit stronger. And I purposely, there was no dating or relationships or anything. I spent a year going to therapy, hiking. I started writing a lot. I started, it sounds like a silly 70s, self-help book,
No, no,
but
no. You started, step by step. You were
I
doing things
had
to
to
help
get
yourself.
stronger in every possible way. And I was finally, after about a year and a half, I was like physically strong, mentally strong, top of my game. I just bought my first house. I was writing movies. And then I met George, and it pivoted in a different way.
No, no, no. Let's just, happily ever after. There's a funny story you tell that you went on a date with George and you were so open about your Zoloft that
Yeah.
he said, "Oh, me too."
Yeah. So we were set up on a date, and this is my husband's George Stephanopoulos, and I knew who he was. And I I didn't even shower or shave my legs. I just read the New York Times, so I seemed smart. I really didn't think it was going to take. I met him at the restaurant. We sat down, and the first thing we talked about was what antidepressant we were on. And that just launched into a whole conversation. And, we were engaged 2 months later and married for 20 years. So
I just want to tell you that there is something called assortative mating, which I've talked to you about, that people find each other. So people with anxiety find other people with anxiety, and people with ADHD find other people. And it happens. So, they understand each other. They can explain the feelings. So it kind of makes sense. I just want to stop with one last question, which is, you got COVID early.
Yep.
What advice might you have for parents who are trying to take care of their kids and battle COVID at the same time? Because that you had to do that.
I like to tell people over and over again that we're all in this together. It is not something that has just happened to you or to me. We're together in this. And if you have to reach out for help, because it does take a village. I spoke to a woman today, her mother, who she was so worried about getting COVID, moved into the house with them. They all quarantined together. And this is a working mom who couldn't afford to not keep her job, and her kids are at home, remote learning. I mean, so yeah, you bring in the grandma, you bring in the neighbor, like anybody that can help.
So Ali, thank you.
Thank you, Harold.
1 in 5 kids struggle with a mental health or learning disorder. And I think right now during COVID, every child's mental health is affected by this. That doesn't mean they will have a mental health disorder, but we have to take care of our kids, especially during this kind of, global pandemic, the stress. So that means that all of us know and love one of these kids. So there are children, there are friends' kids, our kids' classmates. And Ali, you have been an amazing advocate and such an honest, open individual, willing to share your story to make it easier for others. And so I thank you for that. And I thank you for all the support you give the Child Mind Institute. So for leaders in the audience, what would you tell them about the importance of supporting this cause?
Of the Child Mind Institute?
Yes.
I would tell you this, particularly right now in this moment, like Harold said, a child that isn't anxious, there's something wrong with them. It is a scary, uncertain time, and we have to take care of our children, particularly these children right now that are remote learning, that are quarantined. The anxiety is off the charts, the suicide is off the charts, the depression. And the wonderful thing, and the reason that I even started a podcast, was because of the Child Mind Institute. And because at the Child Mind Institute, not only they're helping our children, but they're doing it so that they can help so many underserved kids. And now, plus with remote learning is remote therapy. Any ways that the Child Mind Institute can reach out and help our children, they do. And there is no other place in the world that I support more than that. CMI I'm speaking from a whole Zoloft family. CMI is helping this next generation of children that are growing up in a pandemic with civil unrest.
Ali, thank you so much for participating in this conversation, for your honesty, your good humor, your optimism, and thank you all for spending time with us and listening to this important conversation. And please take care of yourselves, stay well, stay safe, and most importantly, please take care of your children.